My task today is to present our guest, Stefano L'Occaso. Stefano L'Occaso is a young art historian, born in Rome 45 years ago, and is, in my opinion, the most appropriate person to open the work on the project for the Ducal Palace of Mantova, which is the subject of study of the workshop. Stefano L'Occaso training includes a degree in History of Art in 1997 at La Sapienza University in Rome, a certificate from the School of Specialization in History of Art in 2000 at the University of Florence, and a PhD in History of Visual Arts in 2009 at the University of Milan. Stefano L'Occaso is an art historian who began his activity between 1993 and 1999 as a restorer of paintings and mosaics. In 2000, he won the national competition at the Superintendency of the Artistic and Historical Heritage of Mantova as an officer art historian. From December 2011 to September 2012, he is director of the Palazzo Ducale Museum and will still be substitute director from May to June 2017. From May 2014 to October 2015, he is director of the Castle of San Giorgio in the Museum of Palazzo Ducale, and from November 2015 to October 2018, he is director of the Regional Museum Center of Lombardy, the Polo Museale Regionale della Lombardia, where he will also be an officer in 2018 and 2019. The current role of Stefano, since February 2019, is that of officer art historian at the Palazzo Ducale in Mantova. Stefano L'Occaso was the curator of numerous exhibitions and participated in a large number of conferences. And he's a member of many scientific committees, in detail in the city of Mantova, of the Accademia Nazionale Virgiliana, of the Board of Directors of Palazzo Ducale, of the International Art Center of Palazzo Te, of the Foundation Leon Battista Alberti in Mantova, and in Milan, of the Board of Directors of the Pinacoteca di Brera. Among the numerous books published, I point out a book on the Ducal Palace of Mantova in 2002 and a guide in Italian and English in 2007, which is in the bibliography of our teaching. In addition to the general catalogue of the palace collections and a recent book on painting in Mantova in the 15th century. There are more than 160 articles and essays. This is the Stefano L'Occaso rich curriculum. As a colleague, I can say that he taught in our Master of Science in Architectural Design and History from 2013 to 2016 in the teaching of History of Modern Art, and is currently a member of the advisory committee of the Mantova campus. As a friend, I like to remember that my personal knowledge with Stefano was born from his invitation to collaborate together as a thesis supervisor for international students seeking to know and understand distant places in an attempt to help students redesign their countries of origin. Furthermore, I was favorably impressed by his extreme youthful availability in the work of exhibition at the Archaeological Museum of Mantova, active in person in examining and placing the exhibited pieces. With the same approach, Stefano decided to organize his lecture this morning with an interpretation of Palazzo Ducale, useful for the work you are doing, combining the knowledge of the historian with the knowledge of the museum operator. The title is Palazzo Ducale, a methodological overview, I thank you, and I immediately give the floor to Stefano L'Occaso.
Thank you very much. I really hope you can hear to me quite fine, and that my voice doesn't sound like coming from the moon. Today's introduction to the Ducal Palace will be split into three parts. First, I will summarize its development from 14th century to nowadays in a very general and fast way. Second, I will expose a few data about its modern transformation into a museum. And third, I will try to give you some insight about the way such a palace was articulated and how people lived and worked inside. The last section has to do, more or less, with the grammar of the building, and we will surrender to the fact that Italian architecture has as many grammar rules and exceptions as Italian language. No lecture may substitute a visit to the monument, but today it's absolutely impossible because the museum is closed, but I do really wish you will come to visit the Palazzo Ducale as soon as possible. So, first, a brief history of the building. The Ducal Palace, you can see the facade on Piazza Sordello, can be fully understood, which is the second slide, can be fully understood only by knowing its genesis and evolution, albeit in general terms. That is, the chain of historical events and moments that transformed into stone and brick and plaster make it an absolutely unique architectural and artistic complex of its kind. To briefly illustrate the evolution and excellence of the Palatine complex, I decided to follow its birth and evolution. If the palace consisted at first of isolated buildings and volumes, it later turned into an organic and extremely stratified complex, both from an architectural and urban point of view. In order to study the palace and its continuous beddings, we need to examine it at the monumental first floor, fully decorated, but transformations are far more visible at the ground floor or at the second floor, where walls are not coated with plasters and frescoes, and let us see many of the changes that occurred. I'm sorry that due to this technical problem, I'm not seeing what you will see on the screen. So I do hope the images I have in mind coincide with what you can see. So let's pass to the third image. We should be only with text. If the evolution and transformation of the monument coincides in substance with the long government of the Gonzaga family from 1328 to 1707, its genesis dates back to an earlier phase at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries, when Mantua was governed by the Bonacossi family. Please, Luigi, could we pass to the following slide where we see a circa 1350 above? The Bonacossi were almost certainly responsible for the construction of the two Gothic-style buildings overlooking the central Piazza Sordello, formerly Platea Sancti Petri, due to the city cathedral dedication to St. Peter. So you can see in the image as number 1 and 2. One is the Captain Palace, and 2 is the Magna Domus. There is apparently the first curious thing to know. Normally, Italian late Middle Ages cities have 3 main squares, at least 3 main squares. One dedicated to the market, another one to the religious power. We can pass to the following image. One dedicated to the market, one to the religious power, a third for the secular power. And sometimes we have also a civic power, which is symbolized by a fourth square. In the case of Mantua, we have something quite similar, because we can see on the lower left Piazza dell'Erbe, which was the marketplace. Then we have a civic power in Piazza Broletto with the building facing on the Piazza Broletto. But then we have a single square, Piazza Sordello, where are facing the political power and the religious power, so the cathedral as well as the Gonzaga palaces. But did it occur from the very beginning? The Palazzo del Capitano and the Magna Domus arose at the highest and therefore healthiest area of the ancient urban nucleus, the Civitas Vetus, so the old city, not far from the ancient Middle Ages church dedicated to the Holy Cross. In the map, you can see it pointed out as 7A, which is the old church of the Holy Cross, while number 1 is the cathedral, and 14 is the main Gonzaga nucleus. In the Bonacolsi area, the square in front did not yet have the current size and shape, which it probably reached only in the second half of the 14th century. So, probably originally the palace of the power of the ruler and the religious power, so the cathedral, were isolated, were not facing each other. We may also consider this intervention, the demolition of houses and maybe palaces or towers existing in the lower part of the square, as the first major urban shaping by the Gonzaga. That is, the Bonacolsi leader originally lived in another palace not far from the Ducal Palace. It's the Palazzo Ducale, which is number 16 in the map. You can see it also from the following image, where you see a view of the square. On the left, you have Palazzo del Capitano. On the far right, you have Palazzo Cerbicadenazzi, that was the original site where the Gonzaga, the Bonacolsi, and later the Gonzaga stood, and the cathedral. They are quite far away, and originally they were isolated through buildings that stood in the middle of Piazza Sordello, that were demolished no later than 1352. So when in 1328 Luigi Gonzaga forcibly took control of the city and the buildings built by the Bonacolsi, he became the governor of the city, but lived in the Palazzo Cerbicadenazzi, originally separated from the religious center, as occurred normally in Middle Ages cities. The Gonzaga immediately engaged in the restructuring of the Palazzo del Capitano. Architectural interventions followed each other on a regular basis during the centuries, and had in common a rare use of stone, where the brick constitutes the skeleton and the flesh of the palace. Often also the brick constitutes the skin of the palaces, but from the late 15th century on, we have many traces of external frescoes that coated the buildings and transformed them into something far more precious than the raw materials might have suggested. You have to imagine that the whole of the center of the city was coated with frescoes, and frescoes tended to imitate precious marbles and rare decorations. So the buildings, which are quite rough in their actual aspects, were instead coated with frescoes that gave them a far more precious appearance. Let's go to the next slide, please, where we have a further map, a further drawing, let's say a graphic. At the end of the 14th century, here we are in 1450, but we are summarizing what happened at the end of the 14th century and beginning of the 15th century. At the end of the 14th century, the engineer Bartolino Ploti built the castle of San Giorgio, located on the edge of the city, close to the walls. By the mid-15th century, the Gonzaga had essentially created two main nuclei, one residential overlooking Piazza Sordello, so the old palaces where you can find numbered as two. So 2 is the old court with the Gonzaga palaces, and number 1 is the castle, quite far away from the old court buildings. And the castle was the military nucleus overlooking the Ponte di San Giorgio. Let's go to the following image. The building of a castle, we can see an image of the castle built at the turn of the 14th century. The castle was built alongside the city walls and this was a typical late Middle Ages intervention. The castle served as an anticipation of the city defense facing a possible danger, and at the same time constituted a protection for the tyrant. If we go to the following image, we can see one more view of the castle from above. The view is from the bell tower, from the Santa Barbara bell tower, and we can see that the castle is at the very edge of the city borders, so it was flanking this Middle Ages city walls. Let's go to the following slide where you can see some text. So, in case of internal turmoil, the Gonzaga, in case of a rebellion, the Gonzaga might have easily taken shelter out of the city, which is a concept also described by Leon Battista Alberti. So, that is, Alberti in many cases is not inventing, but just fixing a tradition and is theorizing something that currently happened in the late Middle Ages. So there were many reasons. Sorry, Luigi?
Yes.
Did you say something?
Can
I go on?
The slide?
You should see a slide with a text that against the castle was built for military purposes.
Hey, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So when the Gonzaga moved from the old court to the castle, it was due to more than one reason. So moving from the old court, so from the Palazzo del Capitano to the castle meant many things. First of all, the Gonzaga needed to leave the old court as dwellings for the Pope, because a council was held in Mantua in 1459, 1460, and the Pope Pio II was housed in Corte Vecchia. A second reason is that, as we saw reading Leon Battista Alberti, that the castle better embodied the house of the tyrant. So a tyrant should live in a castle rather than in a normal palace. The third reason is that, according once more to Leon Battista Alberti, placing oneself in elevated place brings greatness. A large landscape with water and hills and a vast country before your eyes also endows greatness. So the castle had at the same time a military and residential purpose, including prisons. What's nice? Okay, I will go on. The panorama view from the castle was indeed, and still partly is, glorious, as the Mantegna's Death of the Virgin, today Madrid Prado testifies. This painting that we can see in the following slide. So in the following slide, you will see the painting with the Death of the Virgin by Mantegna. Shows what could be seen from the windows of the castle in the 15th century, and testifies what Alberti asked for a princely residential dwelling. In the 16th century, a hanging garden was built as part of Margherita Paleologo's apartment, thus stressing the relation between built and landscape. So at the end of the 15th century, at the turn between 15th and 16th century, the relation between architecture and landscape became also very important. And we have many important documentation about this passage, also from letters written by the Gonzaga to Leonardo da Vinci, asking him maps and plans about a villa set in a large landscape. So the manor, the castle, let's go to the following image, took the name of Castello di San Giorgio and served both as for military purpose. It had prisons, the dungeons we can see in the image. I hope you have before your eyes. So this dark, not very comfortable prisons. But at the same time, at the first floor, at the ground and first floor, it housed the Gonzaga family. The entrance to the city was thanks to a road. We can see it in the following image. So on the top, we see this sort of island, which is not really an island, which is the San Giorgio town, which is connected to Mantova through a bridge. The bridge is number 1, the San Giorgio Bridge. Number 2 is the gate dedicated to Our Lady of Mercy. It was called the Porta della Misericordia, so the gateway of the Mercy, which sided also an hospital. So there was an hospital close, connected to the gate, the city gate, as normally occurred at the time for healthy reasons. And this road then passed alongside the southern side of the castle, crossing the future Palatine complex and curved into Piazza Sordello. So entered Piazza Sordello, which is number 4. Number 3 is the castle, number 4 is Piazza Sordello, while number 5 is the Old Court, the buildings on the Old Court. The 14th century complex was already expanded at the time by the construction of new factories. But the next image shows us how the buildings evoluted. So from the castle, which originally was only a stronghold, became later a residential place, and architecturally was evoluted, changed, was transformed into something more elegant. And in 1531, Giulio Romano built an apartment for Margherita Paleologo, so the bride to Federico II Gonzaga. And this apartment that we can see in this image, where we see a hand pointing directly to the building, this building was a 16th century apartment, also owing a hanging garden. So the relation between architecture and landscape became far more important during the 16th century. Let's go to the following image, where we can see what Giulio Romano built inside the Ducal Palace in the 16th century, when the palace was growing. Other buildings were added, presumably isolated through, although all protected by a city wall perfected in the 70s of the 14th century. So the area that was protected by Middle Ages walls was turned into a single Palatine complex, but originally the single buildings were isolated. The first fully Renaissance-style building was the Domus Nova, new house in Latin, built in 1480-1484 by the Tuscan sculptor and engineer Luca Fancelli. The building responds in various respects to the typology foreseen by the Filarete treatises, and in all probability, its facade looking south towards the Lago Inferiore, lower lake, towered from a vast terrace, maybe the first one in the Gonzaga Palatine complex. The altimetry differences problem among the different areas included the walls of the Civitas Vetus and was sold only in the second half of the 16th century. But the Domus Nova laid the foundation for the solution of the problem. Important interventions occurred so during the 16th century, both architectural and decorative, and were completed in the early decades of the Cinquecento, 16th century, when Isabella d'Este built her widowal apartment in the Old Court, and Giulio Romano built at first the apartment for Margherita Paleologa that we saw in the previous image, and now we should see the image of the Hall of Troy, so the frescoes of the Hall of Troy, which were painted by Giulio Romano and workshop inside an apartment which was called the Troy apartment, a magnificent building, a magnificent apartment built in the 30s of the 16th century. This room is extremely important and was frescoed by Giulio Romano in his workshop. You have to imagine that the single vault of this hall is covered with 140 square meters of frescoes, and therefore constitutes one of the maximum results achieved by Giulio Romano, also in terms of representation of space and relationship between the work and observer. But we're not talking about this peculiar problem. I wish to show you also in the following image a detail of the facade of another building built by Giulio Romano, the Rustica. At the end of the 30s of the 16th century, Giulio Romano built this exceptional small palace, which presents a prospect animated by twisted columns and ashlars and rough clues, with extraordinary pictorial and vibration effects. The so-called Rustica faces the lake, and at the same time, the Troy apartment. We can find this peculiar characteristic of double facade buildings from 15th to 16th century, and it was a major concern for the Gonzaga. In the following image, we can see how the complex was spreading and increasing. This graphic shows us the Palatine complex around 1560. Many more buildings have been added, and as we can see, the Domus Nova, so number 1 was a Renaissance, a late 15th century building. Then we have Isabella d'Este's apartment in the Old Court, which is number 2. Number 3 is the Troy apartment built by Giulio Romano. And then we have number 4, the Rustic, also built by Giulio Romano. And number 5, which is Piazza Castello, which was began at in the mid-16th century. Let's go to the following image. The palace has increased much more. We are in 1630, and this graphic hypothesizes the structure of the complex at the chronological height of 1630, at the end of a period of extraordinary fervor, which substantially coincides with the second half of the 16th century, or with the government of the Dukes Guglielmo Gonzaga, ruling from 1557 to 1587, and Vincenzo Gonzaga I, ruling from 1587 to 1612. The almost exponential growth of the Palatine complex led the Gonzaga to completely cover an area that in ancient times was 3 medieval districts. In a sense, a large portion of the ancient Civitas Vetus ended up coinciding with the perimeter of the new immense Palatine complex. Guglielmo Gonzaga and Juan Battista Bertani, the prefetto del Fabbriche, so the building's superintendent, engaged mainly in 2 directions. The first was the construction of new buildings. Thus arose the Palatine Basilica of Santa Barbara. We are now at the beginning of the 17th century, when the palace has reached its maximum extension, not coinciding with the extension of the museum. So the museum covers an area which is smaller than the original extension of the Ducal Palace. The sack of Mantua in 1630 by the imperial troops and the following plague gave the start to a period that, with ups and downs, led to the early 18th century collapse. In 1707, the Gonzaga were chased from Mantova, and Mantua was governed by the Habsburgs from Austria from 1707 to 1866. The Habsburg government gave impetus to theatrical life, encouraging the reconstruction of the Archduke Theater, which is the theater which is on the where now is the Museo Archeologico, the archaeological museum, and the interiors were restored mainly in the Corte Vecchia area, while the so-called Corte Nuova, so the Troy apartment and the Appartamento Grande di Castello, were mostly abandoned. The castle was mainly turned into political prisons, archive and political prisons. So if we go in the following slide, we can see the 19th century Habsburg political prisons in the upper floor of the castle, and we can also see a drawing which is now in Alessandria, city in Piedmont, which is showing a prisoner in the castle, and the writing down says "Carcere durissimo in Mantova," so very hard prison in Mantova. Let's go to the following image, which should be the 1866 palace extension. Once more, a graphic. Mantua, in the 1866, became part of the crown of the Kingdom of Italy, and the Ducal Palace too. But the Ducal Palace was donated in 1887 to the Ministry of Education. Possibly it became a museum in the very same year, so 1887, but we have no archival trace about its becoming an open museum. The complex was a few years later subject to a vast campaign of restorations, which lasted until the 30s of the 20th century, and which essentially determined its current appearance. Some parts were indiscriminately demolished. Let's say, for example, the exedra that closed Piazza Sordello and connected the palace with the cathedral, and the apartment of the Paleologa by Giulio Romano, as we can see in the following image, which is an archive photo, a late 19th century image showing the demolition of the building created by Giulio Romano in 1531. Also, the comic theater on the southern western edge of the complex was demolished. Furthermore, the Ministry of Education was assigned a massive building that do not coincide with the real size of the complex. Among other things, the Basilica of Santa Barbara was assigned to the diocese, so to the church, and so it was not anymore part of the property of the Ducal Palace. Now it's property of the church. And other buildings overlooking Piazza Sordello were excluded. The current extension of the complex is therefore significantly lower than its extension in the Gonzaga era. Nonetheless, it is of grandiose proportions. Let's go to the following slide, which is a textual slide, a report dated. Okay, to clarify the size of a unique Palatine complex in the world, but also to make its intuition critical and fragile, it can be specified that the Palazzo Ducale Museum has over 30,000 square meters of covered surface, and a report dated 1876 lists as many as 45 halls, 500 rooms, 4 gardens, 22 courtyards, 120 cottages, so outhouses, 4 stables, 45 undergrounds, 7 towers, a church, and it stands a theater. So it was really, really huge. So let's try to say something about the transformation of the Ducal Palace as a museum, but this section I want to approach it in a very, very short way. So the Ducal Palace had, as soon as in the 16th and 17th century, a partially museum destination. Let's go to the following image. You should see a circa 1600 gallery, which is the Galleria della Mostra, the exhibition gallery. In this age, so at the turn of the 16th century, large galleries were created and filled with paintings, sculpture, and all kinds of artworks. But the Gonzaga collection are almost completely dispersed, and almost nothing remains of the antique Renaissance furnishings and signs of the Gonzaga court life. Everything was sold or robbed, stolen. The museum is set up with works from the Pico di Mirandola Palace arrived in Mantova in 1716, or with collections of paintings from ecclesiastical late 18th century suppressions, so items, works of art, paintings, and sculpture that had nothing to do with the story of the Palatine complex, had nothing to do with the story of the Gonzaga. There are artworks, those housed today in the palace, which come from other buildings, churches, and their belonging to the palace is quite a modern one. Since the end of the 19th century, the museum has been conceived not only as a monumental building, in a certain sense, a museum of itself, but also a container for a plethora of collections, mostly disconnected and untied from each other, which have been generally exhibited with criteria of mild chronological relevance. It has been usually opted for installation divided by chronological segments, linked to the container placed by a relative chronological relevance. The medieval works in the Palazzo del Capitano, the Renaissance artworks have been placed in the Castello di San Giorgio, while Baroque paintings have been exhibited in the ducal apartment and other rooms in the Corte Vecchia. However, on this occasion, I do not want to approach the palace with a strictly museographic glance. This would imply a much longer presentation due to the complexity of the building. The museum is mainly a monumental building. a museum of itself, but a few relevant collections do exist. Let's say, for example, as we can see in the following image, with Flemish weavers after cartoons by Raphael, we have tapestries after cartoons by Raphael, which are now housed in the Ducal Palace in an apartment which was created on purpose, built on purpose around 1780. So one of the first apartments created on purpose to house artworks in the Habsburg age. And then we have also inside the museum an important masterpiece by Peter Paul Rubens that we can see in the following image. The Gonzaga worshipping the Holy Trinity, 1605, is a very important work of art opening to the Baroque age, which is housed inside the Ducal Palace. But it will be particularly inappropriate to forget to mention at least the remarkable collection of classical statuary preserved in the museum and coming largely from Sabbioneta. At the end of the 18th century, the Sabbioneta palaces were robbed from their sculptural furniture in view of the creation of a large statuary museum, Museo Statuario was called, in Mantova. A museum that at its inception, at its beginning, boasted a primacy in Italy for the number and importance of the works collected there. One of the works is the marble relief we see in the following image with Pluto and Proserpina, which is one of the few marble sculptures coming directly from the Ducal Palace, because 90% of the marbles of the Museo Statuario, of the Statuary Museum, come from the Sabbioneta collections. So they were not originally linked to the building. In our perception of the historic building, what do we have to add to our imagination to perceive it as it was originally? So most of the original look of the palace is lost, especially in the interiors. We do not have the Gonzaga collections. We do not have the original floors, almost no pavement remaining in the palace can be dated earlier than 1800, so before the beginning of the 19th century. And also, the lighting system has totally changed. We have no longer the original doors. We have no fabrics at the walls. And unluckily, no visual reference is available for interiors. So we do not have paintings showing us how interiors should have looked like. But I wish to propose a few considerations, a few general considerations about the palace and how it was used and inhabited. And I think that this is the most interesting and original part of this lecture. Let's go, please, Luigi, let's go to the following slide, which is a textual one, the sources. Okay. What are the tools for studying the palace in its Renaissance configuration? We have, first of all, visual sources, such as paintings, drawings, and old maps. Planimetries, we have planimetries dating back from the late 16th century. We have the map, the Venice map we saw before, which is mid-15th century. We have many different visual sources that we can consider when studying the Ducal Palace. Then we have, and they are extremely important, archival sources and literature in general. We have letters talking about the building of a single palace, letters from Giulio Romano to the Gonzaga, letters from Luca Fancelli to the Gonzaga, from the Gonzaga to Andrea Mantegna, and telling us about the works being carried on by the artists, by the architects, especially by the architects, because they were architecture was far more expensive than painting, and so normally we have far more documentation about architecture than other kind of art productions, such as sculpture or painting. So we have important archival sources, such as inventories, but any other written description, also travel literature. So when travelers came in Mantova and described what they could see,
they give us very important sources. And then another important source to be taken into consideration are comparative sources. When we are studying Ducal Palace, we need to compare it with other buildings, other palaces, Renaissance palaces. Except, for example, Ferrara has many elements in common with Mantova. So when we study the two courts together, we can understand both of them much better. So this Ducal Palace was a sort of weird, huge Mantuan Frankenstein, bearing great altimetric differences and exposure, and was built to be a self-sufficient citadel, as we can see from the following slide, which is once more a textual slide. So a Renaissance apartment is the nucleus, the cell of the palace, but we have also a number of other elements, of other buildings and architecture, which can be internal, external, or can have mixed views and mixed access. But we will try to see some of these cases in detail. This huge Gonzaga citadel was self-sufficient, as I told you a few seconds ago. It had workshops, kitchens, gardens, stables, even a pharmacy, so a drugstore. If the Gonzaga needed some medicine, they had their own private drugstore. They didn't need to go outside of the complex. They had a harbor, so they had their ships inside the Palatine complex, and so they could leave from the Ducal Palace, and were absolutely autonomous from every point of view. They had more than one theater, and even a hospital, which is today's main concern, unluckily. First of all, particular attention should be paid to the terminology used to indicate its spaces. With the loss of its function as a court and its conversion into a museum, the Ducal Palace has seen a continuous lexical transformation, with modern names almost always suggested by the subject of the decorations of the rooms, or sometimes suggested by misunderstandings in the reading of archival documents, with the possibility of ambiguity and, above all, the loss of historical memory. Just think that the term Corte Vecchia that we saw should be assigned to the Gonzaga buildings facing Piazza Sordello was instead applied from 1889 to 1921 to what is today called the Corte Nuova, so the Troy apartment and the Appartamento Grande di Castello. In this regard, it should be remembered that the term castle, for example, in the 16th century documents indicated not only the building of the Castello di San Giorgio, so the castle itself, so the stronghold, but indicated the entire surrounding area pertinent to it. The study of terminology certainly offers important indications. The very configuration of the Mantua court transpires from some denominations, proposing a parallel with the Nervi court of Ferrara, where similar spatial indications were used. In both, the original nucleus of power is an old castle, an old court, to which a castle will be added later. And the castle in Mantova and in Ferrara were also built by the same architect. So Bartolino Cloti is the engineer responsible for the building of the castles of Mantova and Ferrara, which look like twin courts, absolutely alike. The study of terminology certainly offers important indications. The very configuration of the Mantua court transpires from some denominations, proposing a parallel, with the Nervi court, as I told you, but the impoverishment in the nomenclature of the interior spaces of the palace can be felt in the inventories of the early 19th century. And shortly after, when it officially turned into a museum, so when the palace turned into a museum, possibly around 1887, all the rooms were classified as sale. Sale, possibly the English term for sala is hall, losing the functional meaning of many more terms. So in Italian, we have a lot of different terms, camera, camerino, cameretta, camerone, sala, saletta, salone, and which indicate different size of the interiors, in the interior rooms, the interior spaces, and possibly also different shapes. And all of this variety, this richness, the terms was lost from the end of the 19th century, when the palace became a museum, and all the spaces, the interior spaces, became known indistinctly as sale, hall. So the term sala, hall, originally designated only the larger area placed at the solemn entrance of the various apartments, if necessary, monitored by guards. Originally, the variety of terms might also have suggested the architectural shape of the space. Possibly room stood for a square space, while hall for a rectangular space. Consequently, from the 20th century, these sale followed one another in a sequence which has little to do with their primitive belonging to the various apartments, reducing the building to an incomprehensible labyrinth. The rhythm of the building, so it's being made up by a number of different apartments separated from each other, was irreparably lost in a continuum, in a visit itinerary. Moreover, the today museal fruition to the building has totally erased the caesura between one apartment and the following, and this problem has been enhanced by recent studies that tend to underline internal fluidity, while originally there was no internal fluidity. There were many connecting elements, but the single parts of the building were isolated because they were inhabited by different persons, and they worked independently from each other, partly independently, of course. The palace was substantially a sum of connected elements or cells. Let's go to the following slide, which is once more textual. And we are talking about the apartment. The apartment is the cell, is the single element constituting which is part of the whole of the building. And there were also connecting elements which linked the different apartments, which were, let's say, for example, staircases, squares, courtyards, galleries, and gardens. Let's try to talk about the apartment, appartamento. First of all, is the term modern or ancient, and what does it stand for? The name appartamento, so apartment, occurs only from the 16th century in Italian literature and is almost unknown abroad. As to the etymology, doubtless appartamento and apartato, which means secluded, have a single root, which underlines the fact that we are talking about private places. The famous Italian poet Torquato Tasso, in 1572, wrote about living in France, and I'm translating you from the Italian language. Torquato Tasso wrote about living in France that I do not find in French houses that comfort for which they were praised. Add that the rooms are mostly dark and melancholy, and add that there is no continuity of rooms which creates a comfortable apartment shape. Such are usually the homes of private individuals. So, in the homes of private individuals in France, there were no apartments existing. There was no sequence of rooms constituting an apartment, which is instead the basis of a Renaissance Italian palace. How is a typical apartment built? And are there types that persist over time? Let's say in the following image, we have, for example, first of all, we have a prefixed sequence. So an apartment is made of a sequence of spaces which are quite fixed. An apartment can have or retain a precise function and can hold this function on the time. So even passing from one inhabitant to another. There can be the apartment of the lord, of her lady, of his lady, so the mistress, the apartment of the prince that will become real later. There can be the apartment of the widow, so the woman who had married the Gonzaga, who is now dead, And we can have also summer and winter apartments. As a rule, names that clarify functions are used for the rooms of the governors according to a progression dependent on the court ceremonial. But take care that rooms may easily change or may have multiple uses. Let's go to the following image where we can see a detail of the frescoes by Mantegna in the Camera degli Sposi, so a Renaissance masterpiece. The Camera degli Sposi, painted by Mantegna and completed in 1474, was used the following year as a set for a notarial act. In that occasion, the room is cited as a Camera Magna Picta Audientiae. In Latin, it means large painted audience room. So it was used for as a set of a notarial act, but it was also the audience room. And moreover, the presence of iron hooks allowed the presence also of a canopy bed. And in 1573, the room, this large room, was used for a honeymoon. I would not suggest to repeat the feat because today we have a closed circuit television installed. A standard rural apartment is made up at first by a guard room, and now we see in the following image another detail of the Camera degli Sposi with the west wall, and in the next slide we see the Sala degli Arcieri, so bowman hall, where the guards stood. They were equipped with weapons, bows in this case, so they were the archers, and this huge hall is called Sala degli Arcieri, hall of the archers or bowmen. So a standard rural apartment is made up at first by a guard room, where the guards stood, followed by the rooms of the ushers, by room helpers, and then we reach the hearing or audience room. Adjacent to the bedroom, and then the retreat rooms, the private core of an apartment. Hence, the main rooms of the apartment were two: the hall, whose main purpose was representative, and the bedroom, the lord's private place. Between one and the other, there were functions of filters room inhabited by servants in number proportion to the rank of the owner, up to the hearing room, so the sala dell'udienza, the audience room, the last public space before the bedroom, which is the first private part of an apartment, and the bedroom was finally followed by the retrocamere, rear cameras of smaller dimensions, but with higher living comfort. Inside an apartment, we have a series of places that today we tend to distinguish on the basis of size and use. An apartment usually consisted of a sequence of rooms, as I told you, from the largest to the smallest, preceded in some cases by an area intended for guards, such as the one we see in the slide we can see. The apartment closes with the more private rooms, and often apartments are also endowed with a study room and a chapel that may also often be related. That is, so they are normally very close to each other, and often we know that chapels were standing above the study room, so the studiolo. Inventories give sometimes proceeding hierarchical orders, but now I think we better not talk too much about inventories that may take us far from the goal of this intervention. Let's talk again about the name of the rooms, which derive from the location, the use, the decorations, the furniture, the dimensions, and even the number of fireplaces, or the number of windows, or any characteristic architectonic element. Some names are common in all Middle Ages palaces, and Renaissance palaces as well, such as the caminata, which is a room which has more than one fireplace. It was a large and very important space. Camera picta, instead, is a fully painted room, so it is a common name. It's not the proper name, the single name of the room painted by Mantegna in Mantova. Every palace had its own camera picta, painted room, which was fully painted from the top to the bottom. But more rarely, the name derives from other factors, and certainly, let's go to the following image. We have an exception in Mantova, in the Ducal Palace, with the Pisanello Hall. So the hall owes its name to the artist who decorated it, Antonio Pisano, called Pisanello. It is really an exception, and you can see also another detail of the paintings in the following slide, where we see a corner view of the paintings. So normally, when a room bears a name, it is the personal name only reference to he or she who lives there at a certain time. A lot has been written in the last decade, especially about the abitare all'antica, so to live as ancient state. Considering some features of the dwelling system, something typical of the Renaissance reprise from antiquity. But I need to advise that such a reprise pre-exists in Leschi, Dell'arte, and Montaigne, and we can find important roots of this revival in the 14th century, especially at the age of Petrarch and immediately after, but we should also consider the hypothesis of an earlier origin. Let's see a couple of examples. Let's go to the following slide, where we are quoting Leon Battista Alberti. First, so the distinction between male and female apartments. We used to write that such a distinction between the bride's apartments dates back to Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti wrote, text is translated, the wife's house will be totally separated from the house of the prince, except for the last apartment and for the nuptial bedroom. It must be in common, otherwise probably there will be no prince ever born. But Alberti is not inventing anything. This kind of distinction pre-exists Renaissance, and in the case of Mantova, can be dated back at least to 1380. There were rooms at the time indicated in documents as a latere dominarum, so in princesses' wing, and the two apartments, so the apartment of the lord and of the mistress, had normally a common room, so were tiled by a single common room where there was normally the bedroom. This is also documented by an important 1391 source, so the trial against Agnese Visconti, first wife of Francesco Gonzaga, later beheaded for adultery. So she used to meet her lover in her private room, but from the sources we know that there was a common room, the room of the emperors, ubi ubabat cum domino, so where she used to lie with the lord. We have no indication about the space percentage inhabited by women rather than by men, and horizontal relationship between the apartments at the turn of the 14th century will soon turn into a vertical relationship. So if at the end of the 14th century we have the male and female apartments which are at the same layer, at the same level, and are tied horizontally, later on we will find a vertical relation between these apartments. We may suppose that it was according to hierarchy that male apartments used to stay above women apartments, but possibly this was no rule. So it was the case of Paolo Malatesta and Gianfrancesco Gonzaga. Gianfrancesco had his own apartment above Paolo Malatesta's one, but this relation was totally upset in the case of Isabella d'Este and Francesco II Gonzaga at the end of the 15th century, because Isabella stood at the first floor and Francesco Gonzaga stood at the ground floor of the castle. But 1 century later, at the turn of the 16th century, and let's go to the following slide where we see a staircase, for sure the two huge ducal apartments spread once again horizontally. They were connected by this small staircase, and the two coat of arms that we can see above the doorways show the coat of arms of the two brides. So the coat of arms of the Gonzaga on the left when you entered the Vincenzo Gonzaga apartment, and coat of arms of the Medici on the right when you entered Eleonora de Medici's apartment. So they were married, but they lived in separate apartments, and they used to meet not very often. So normally, princely apartments were placed at the first floor, also for reasons of security, of course. They were not too easily accessible. When a Gonzaga bride became widow, she could stay in the palace, but she should move into a separate an increasing importance of female apartments should be considered, especially during the Renaissance. The new building created and decorated for the wife of Federico II Gonzaga, Palazzina della Paleologa, that we saw also in a couple of slides before, has also been considered as an architectural expression of greater female visibility. Now, let's go to the following slide, where we can see the configuration and the set of the apartments occupied by Federico II Gonzaga and his wife. So, Margherita Paleologo had her apartment, which is outlined in yellow, the slide which had apartments in the castle area. So in yellow, you can see Margherita Paleologo's apartment. Margherita and Federico married in 1531, and so Federico Gonzaga stood in an apartment which was just very close and above Margherita's one. The two apartments were linked, they were tied together. Margherita was at the first floor and Federico at the second floor, but their apartments were very close to each other. In 1534, Margherita had already given Federico a couple of children. So Federico, who did not really love his wife, moved to another apartment, the one outlined in green, which is quite far away. So they were not meeting any longer. When Federico needed to have children, he stood just before the apartment of his bride, and then he moved elsewhere. So the relation between his wife was broken. Federico was escaping from his bride in a certain way. So apartments have a peculiar structure and fixed functions, but a single governor could have even more than one apartment in a single building. For example, a summer one and a winter one. By instance, in the 1407 inventory of the palace, written immediately after the death of Francesco Gonzaga I, a camera januari is described. Possibly, this January room was in the winter apartment. A winter apartment normally consisted in smaller rooms, heated by fireplaces, furnished with fabrics, and possibly looking south. The light exposure is a question that we should always keep in mind when dealing with old buildings. Despite a certain randomness, some selected parts of the palace might have been planned with spatial light exposure, such as the case of the Camera degli Sposi. Let's go to the following image. See the north wall of Mantegna's Camera degli Sposi. Well, this is a room which was apparently decorated after an ancient literary text implying the theatrical effect of rising sunlight. Hence, a window should face east. A chapel inside the palace should probably and preferably be oriented, so it should head to east. A place for marble display, let's go to the following image, so the Galleria dei Marmi, the Marbles Gallery. So a place for marbles display, such as the Galleria dei Marmi, may face south, as varying sharp light may suit a three-dimensional display. Instead, normally full-painted rooms will have limited and controlled light sources, such as we saw in the Camera degli Sposi seen before. So the two windows are one on the east because you need to have this theatrical effect of the rising sun as requested by the literary source of the Camera degli Sposi, but the other window was looking north. So the light was quite dim and controlled. We have a few exceptions from this rule, and one exception is Pisanello's cycle, as we can see in the following slide, which should be number 44. We can see a few details of the cycle with the gilded details of the mural paintings. Well, this is an exception because this decoration is in a room which has large windows facing south. So a lot of light entered. But why? Possibly because all of the gilding, all of this gold, the silver, or the silver plates that were used to the decoration should glitter exactly as a mosaic. So the light was part of the decoration. we should also remind that, for example, that Leonardo da Vinci suggested that painters' workshops should look north, and light should be dimmed and controlled. So the light exposure of every single space was planned and was usually not by chance. Light is part of the building and of its decorations. So we just need to give a wholesome look at the kind of rooms that we can have in the Ducal Palace. We saw the most important decorated rooms, and let's go to the most humble rooms. The following slide, which is an around 1525 richly decorated room, you can see a very small door frame, a very small doorway heading into a very tiny room. What is this room? It's the bathroom. Bathrooms are very seldom indicated in inventories and other sources. And in these rare cases, they are cited as secret places. Generally, all sources are silent about these places, which, in my opinion, let us judge the organization. But the topic was considered too humble for any kind of source, and so we have almost no information about bathrooms, Renaissance bathrooms. We have very few sources. Boccaccio in his Decamerone, there is a novel telling us about a bathroom, but it's very, very, very rare. Instead, when we are moving into the neoclassical age, so in much later periods, such as you can see in the following slide, which is a circa 1810 richly decorated neoclassic bathroom, the bathroom has become something which is monumental. So has far more dignity than it had in the Renaissance. So Renaissance inventories do not tell us anything about bathrooms, but likely tell us about kitchens, which used to be outside princely and residential apartments. Rooms of servants were normally separated and were in the upper floors. So the more humble activities were outside the princely apartment, which had a precise sequence of rooms and which was constituted by a hall and then other filter rooms up to the audience room and the bedroom, and an apartment could also have and normally had a chapel and a study room, a studiolo, a place, a private room where the Lord could stand and study and read and stay on his own, alone. But all of these apartments were linked together by a system, especially is relevant in the case of the Ducal Palace of Mantova. The apartments were linked, were separated, they were independent, but they were linked thanks to a great system of passages and connections. Also, these connections had a great evolution from the 14th century on. Let's see just a couple of examples. Here in the following image, which is the Romanzo Battista Alberti, Cortile della Cavallerizza, we see a large courtyard in a winter view, which is connecting from one side the Troy apartment and the other the rustic apartment, both built by Giulio Romano. But in the 14th century, so in an age earlier than the one shown by this slide, no internal corridors existed. Let's go to the following image, which is the rear facade of the Palazzo del Capitano, a Middle Ages building. At the time, no internal corridors existed, and external wooden balconies allowed the passage from one room to another. Only from mid-15th century, a covered street, so a via coperta, led from the Corte Vecchia to the castle and back, passing nearby a ostrich garden, Orto degli Struzzi. But on the upper floor of the vast complex, the connection between the various rooms in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance was granted by external balconies. In this slide, you can see marble corbels, which sustain wooden balconies. We can also see the square holes that housed wooden beams supporting the balconies, and we have a lot of documentation about these wooden balconies. Even they should have been quite large. There is an act written in 1422, written Super Pontilia apud salam ad obus caminis, and this balcony was large enough to house the notary, the testimonies, and all the figures gathered for the sake of the notarial act. Let's go to the following image, which is a photo of a wooden model suggesting the original entrance to the room of Pisanello, which is the one on the right, partially without the roof. Okay, so according to what we can see on the outside of the Palazzo del Capitano, the marble corbels and the traces of the wooden beams, so we know that there were wooden balconies outside that led inside the Sala del Pisanello. But over time, the external passages became internal. So I suppose that this reconstruction is wrong, it's erroneous, because as we can see in the following image, which is number 50, the possible circa 1430 monumental entrance to the hall of Pisanello should have been from that door on the corner, because we have traces of a major marble covered staircase leading up to the first floor, exactly in that area of the palace. So probably at the beginning of the 15th century, wooden balconies became substituted by more important, less ephemeral buildings. The birth and the diffusion of the corridors is dating from the 15th century, but they became extremely important during the 16th century. So while in the 15th century only major connections were safely granted, during the 16th century galleries and corridors arose and were later turned into exhibition places. The palace gets then transformed to a network of corridors and galleries. Let's try to say just a few last words about places of worship, but please look at in the following image to a large staircase which was built at the beginning of the 7th century. It is called the Scalone delle Duchesse. It's a typical staircase, large internal staircase, which was built in the late Renaissance. Okay, let's go to the following slide, which shows what happened in the 1420s when the first Palatine church was built. Sorry, the drawing is my own, so it's not really a great drawing from an architect, but I think it is quite clear, quite enough clear to show what happened when the Gonzaga had their first Palatine church built inside the Palatine complex. As already happens in the 14th century in Italy, the chapels tend to be internal to the building structure with greater or lesser autonomy of architectural forms. The cases of Santa Croce, the one we can see in the slide, and then of Santa Barbara, later building, are exemplary. The first chapels tended to be at the first floor as private places of worship, and often above public passageways or above private rooms, such as the studios. So they were quite isolated, and they were always placed at the first floor, the first Gonzaga chapels. When a first Palatine church was built in the 1420s, dedicated to the Holy Cross, it was built as a two-story church with mass given for common people at the ground floor, while at the first floor, which was isolated and separated, only the Gonzaga could access. So the Gonzaga never mixed with the people, with the common people, and were always safe. They were isolated. They tended to live quite isolated also because of reasons of security. Later, Santa Barbara, and the following slide is a photo from, a picture of a drawing traced on a brick, which shows us the original topping of the Santa Croce Church. And the last image is the once more facade of Santa Barbara. You can see it with its bell tower. The church, this huge church, was built in the 60s of the 16th century as the fulcrum of the whole Palatine complex. these churches, also in Santa Barbara, the same hierarchical distinction of the whole palace was held. People could attend to mass at the ground floor, while the Gonzaga had their own private place of worship at a separate higher level. As a conclusion, and really I'm concluding with this last few words, architecture has always had social and symbolic meaning, matching practical needs. We need never to forget how meaningful a Renaissance architecture can be, and the Ducal Palace is the best possible example of this concept. And I do really hope you will be able to visit as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you, Stefano.
For your speech. Also for the interesting interpretation, typological interpretation of living spaces in Palazzo Ducale. Because we are used to think Palazzo Ducale as a museum, but we have to remember that Palazzo Ducale was a living complex.
Some students that want to ask something to Stefano. Carlotta, open your microphone.
Okay, hello. My question is about the servants. Do we know anything about how many people outside of the Gonzaga or like the ruling family lived in the castle? Did they actually, or in the palace, did they actually live there, or did they, commute? Were they spaces specially made for their living and accommodation? Thank you.
Yes, we have a few data about that. So we know that the palace had also apartments for the servants, especially those most closely connected to the Gonzaga. And some sections of the Ducal Palace were inhabited by servants. As, for example, the cook was living in the palace, some servants were living here, the guards, so the soldiers were living here. We had, of course, medicians, drugstore. So there were fixed functions that also needed inhabitants to stay fixedly inside the palace. And then, of course, many people came to work here from outside. But you have to imagine that at the height of the power of the Gonzaga, so in the mid-16th century, we know that some 1,000 people were inhabiting, so working or living inside the Ducal complex, the Ducal Palace complex.
Thank you. And those spaces where the servants lived, do they survive? Are they part of what we visit today, or have been demolished since?
Some of the spaces are still existing. For example, in the upper floor, normally the servants were placed immediately under the roof of a building, so in the hottest and surely not the healthiest part of the building. Parts are still existing. For example, the so-called Appartamento delle Balie is an apartment which is in the upper floor of the Troy apartment by Giro Romano, and there we still have some traces of the original 16th century apartments, which are inhabited also by servants. We have to think that some of these important servants were most beloved by the Gonzaga and used also to live in highly finished spaces, and often these spaces were also decorated. So we should talk about these persons not as slaves. Servants, they were servants, so they held the Gonzaga, they were the lady-in-waiting, and so on, but they were very well treated sometimes. We have instead almost no trace of the dwellings of humble people inside the Ducal Palace because they were totally transformed.
Yes, I have a question. I would like to have a clarification about the history of Sala di Sanello. Because the history of the room, it's for what we know, the room is lower, about 1 meter, compared to the Appartamento di Anna Isabella di Guastalla. And the reason is why, because on the late Cinquecento, the Duke Guglielmo, I think, moved from the castle towards that area and asked the architect Bertani to design the space. So, and you mentioned about hierarchy in that kind of a period, and also at the same time, also the existence of the balcony on the other facade of that is facing Piazza Pallone. So, what do you think the reason why they lowered the ground lower than what we have been from the Guastala's apartment? Thank you very much.
I do hope I fully understood the question, because there was some noise. But I have to remind that the whole of the Pisanello changed shape many times during the centuries. So at first, the roof collapsed in 1480, and so the room was probably transformed in the late 15th century. The pavement was lowered possibly in 1595 or at the very end of the 16th century, so when Bertani was dead, and it was probably lowered also because we may suppose that the original pavement was supported by wooden beams, so probably there was some structural problem also. And in many cases in this area, the original wooden beams of the pavements were supported or substituted by brick vaults, which altered also the shape and the dimension of the spaces. Then the room was transformed also in 1701, in the late 18th century, in 1812, and then in the restorations occurred in the 20th century. I suppose that we have archival sources and as well architectural traces of a major marble decorated staircase leading up at the first floor, which can be easily dated at the beginning of the 15th century. So most probably the wooden balconies were abandoned at the beginning of the 15th century, a little time before or at the same time that the room of the Pisanello was decorated. So it would be very queer, very strange to have an high decorated room, such an important room, and then a small entrance from a wooden balcony, so a non-monumental entrance from a wooden balcony for the same room. So I suppose that the entrance from on the other side also, because it was a protected entrance, so people should not pass through a partly public garden, but may have entered the Pisanello room from a private space, from a private courtyard. And in the end, there is a 16th century, a late 16th century map, a planimetry, which shows us the late Gothic marble staircase still existing, and it was later demolished only in 1615 when the new large broad staircase was built.
Hello again. I have a question about the Church of Santa Barbara and about the presence of the choir, because the retro choir kind of implies that there was a monastic community that was associated with the church. And I was wondering if you have any perhaps information about how this monastic community might have been associated with Santa Barbara, and how was the church run? How was it dependent on external church associations or directly controlled by the Duke?
We have, luckily, we have a lot of information about Santa Barbara and its holdings, so I may talk to you about 5 hours about this problem. Anyway, to be very synthetical, when the Gonzaga built the church, they also created the house of the canonics, which is very close to the same church. It is now facing Via Rubens. So they were normally naming the priest holding the church, and it was a sort of association, a sort of an agreement with the bishop. So the church was not run by monks or friars, so it did not belong to any precise orders such as Franciscans or Dominicans or Carmelitans. It was run by the clergy, by the normal clergy, and the major priest was named to
together by the Gonzaga with the bishop. So it was a sort of communion of intentions in the building of this church, which only later on became separated from the Gonzaga court. So it was strictly under control of the Gonzaga. From every point of view, also the choir, so the musicians, everything was strictly controlled by the Gonzaga.
And so who composed the choir? Was it servants or religious community? Like
religious community, mostly religious community, or also expert musicians. Because in the case of Santa Barbara, for example, we know that the church was built by Guglielmo Gonzaga, who was also quite an able musician. He was writing music. And what is strange enough is that the church was built after the large organ was created. So the organ was created earlier than the church, and the court musicians such as Jacques de Verte or Orlando di Lasso were creating music on purpose for that church. And there was also a number of musicians, partly priests and partly also not priests, who were fixedly employed for the church.
Okay, thank you so much. That was so interesting.
Thank you very much, Stefano. It's very interesting work. Okay.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.